کنفرانس‌های بین‌المللی با شرکت شخصیت‌های سیاسی، تحلیلگران، متخصصان و پارلمانترها درباره رویارویی مقاومت و قیام مردم ایران با دیکتاتوری آخوندی.
کنفرانس آلترناتیو رژیم آخوندی. سخنرانی‌های سناتور رابرت توریسلی، لیندا چاوز مدیر پیشین روابط عمومی کاخ سفید، تونی کلمنت وزیر خزانه‌داری کانادا 2015، وزیر صنایع 2011.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rame. It's a pleasure to be joining this distinguished panel to talk about the issue of alternative. I want to thank all of you for being with us this afternoon. And we will be talking about the path forward. So with me on the panel, it's my great pleasure to introduce Senator Joseph Lieberman, U.S. Senator from 1989 to 2013, and also a Democratic nominee Vice President of 2000. Senator Lieberman, it's so great to have you with us today.
Great to be here. Thank you. Thank you.
And also very, very pleased to have Senator Toriseli, Robert Toriseli, also a U.S. Senator from 1997 to 2003. And of course, Mr. Short, Mark Short, Chief of Staff for Vice President Mike Pence. Very pleased to have you with us today. Mr. Tony Clement, former Canadian parliamentarian member, former Minister of Industry, Minister of Health, and also President of the Treasury of Board of Canada. And of course, my dear friend, very, very dear friend, Ms. Linda Chavez, Director of Center for Equal Opportunity and former Director for Public Liaison of the White House. Senator Toriseli, let me start with you. You obviously have known this resistance movement for many years. You have seen the ups and downs. You have seen the demonization campaign that has led to the wrong policy that has been successfully fought in courts. And now with the uprisings in Iran, now that the Iranian regime is essentially completely delegitimized with the protests and the slogans inside Iran where people are saying death to Khamenei, down with the dictators, the conversation around the alternative has come up. I'd love for you to kind of walk us through on what are the criteria for an alternative that stands up to the challenge of fighting against this regime, because we have seen and we have witnessed a lot of noise and a lot of different failed attempt to forge an alternative that really lacked the credibility and authenticity. So would love to get your thoughts on that question, and then we just kind of go from there.
سناتور رابرت توریسلی: گاهی اوقات بزرگترین درایت از کوچه و خیابان سرچشمه می‌گیرد و آن بچه‌هایی که در خیابان‌های شهرهای ایران فریاد می‌زنند نه به آخوندها نه به شاه، دقیقاً درست می‌گویند. ما آخوندها را نمی‌خواهیم، اما به عقب هم بر نمی‌گردیم.
Certainly, thank you. And it's not my role to welcome everyone, but I do think, given the events of the last couple of days, it is worth saying that I know for many of you coming here is an enormous expense. If you wondered whether it was worth doing, I ask you just to consider several years ago the regime attempted a terrorist attack on this meeting. This year, Reza called Macron to have it canceled. There's been an international effort to keep you from being here. They've only done that for one reason. Your being here has meaning. It is part of the change. The overthrow of the regime begins with you. And being here every year is the best contribution any free citizen can make to freeing Iran. So thank you for being here. I'd like to answer your question really from several perspectives. One, for those of you from Europe or for North America, I've always been curious about something, that if there's the slightest change in governance in France or Italy or Britain or Canada or Australia, it's met with outrage. Democracy is being challenged. We're in danger. But if there's a coup in Latin America, a loss of governance in Africa, if a Middle East nation is thrown into despotic governance, it seemed like it's part of the norm. We live in a time when we talk about believing that people are genuinely equal, and that the prior notions of colonialism and racism are behind us. Are they? Is there some reason why the Iranian people, why they're living in this medieval circumstance of a despotic government that abuses its people in absolute desperate poverty? Why this is seen by some quarters in Washington or London or Paris as acceptable, part of the norm? No people should have to live under these circumstances. The home of my ancestors in Italy, a country that has no natural resources, nothing but the ingenuity of its people, has a per capita income 10 times of Iran, a nation of great wealth and resource, with a rich culture and energetic people. How is it that being born in Iran equates to living in complete poverty, with children with no future? We all know what has to change, but it begins with accepting that which we want for ourselves and our children and the nations of Europe and North America is the same for all other peoples. Then dealing with Iran becomes unacceptable. Compromise becomes unacceptable. There is no compromise with absolute evil, and that's what we're dealing with. Which gets to your question. There are a variety of groups fighting for change in Tehran. I understand that. Some well-intentioned, some not. Some are just props for the regime. If you start on the issue of change in Tehran with believing you can reform the government, you're not part of this movement, you're not part of the answer, and frankly, I don't want anything to do with you. There is no reforming Tehran. That's the beginning of what comes with change. Second, we don't need to go back. Sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the streets. And those kids in the streets of cities of Iran who are yelling, no to the mullahs, no to the Shah, have it exactly right. We're not taking the mullahs, but we're not going back either. That's not the answer either. Now, where does this leave us? Well, you've already answered that. You voted with your bodies, being here today. What does a revolutionary movement require? Dogged determination, incredible focus, the willingness to pay any price to bring change. It requires a people who are completely committed to a cause. I just defined the MEK. It requires resources, because it takes time and it takes money, it takes depth, it takes people who are willing to sacrifice with their own resources. I just defined the MEK. It takes a leadership that will pay any price and has a vision for the future. Not only what they want to destroy, but what they want to create. I just defined Mrs. Rajavi in the 10-point plan. It takes an... And it takes an international coalition with people on the streets, the revolutionary cells that are now throughout Iran helping to lead and direct this movement. That's the MEK. You are part of that change. And finally, most of us have met before. And I've shared with you before, I know 40 years is a long time, except in the eyes of history. It's a long time in the life of a man or woman, but not in history. I've told you the story as a young congressman. I had a multi-ethnic district, and I used to go to these events for Free Poland and Free Hungary, and I shook every hand and I made every speech, but I always laughing under my breath. Are these people kidding? I was young. I didn't understand. They understood. I didn't understand. Of course it changes. Freedom is the inevitable circumstance of man. It doesn't come free. It doesn't come easy. It doesn't come fast, but it comes. We are on our path. I believe it as much as I believe in anything in my life. But what is that alternative? You are the alternative. We have built it. We just have to get over the line. Thank you.
Great. Linda, my question is to you. Senator Toriseli talked about the attributes of an alternative, and I'm going to recap it, where he talked about the leadership of the alternative. He talked about the incredible focus, engagement, and of course, international coalition and presence on the ground. I would love for you to deconstruct the concept of the leadership within the alternative that you think is suitable for Iran, knowing who the Iranian regime is.
لیندا چاوز، مدیر پیشین روابط عمومی کاخ سفید. من معتقدم که شورای ملی مقاومت ایران مسیر پیشرو را ارائه می‌دهد و برنامه 10 ماده‌ای خانم رجبی برنامه‌ای است که به اعتقاد من مورد استقبال مردم ایران قرار خواهد گرفت.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It is always a pleasure to be back among friends and allies in this very important fight. You know, I've been following the MEK and the NCRI for many, many years. It goes back to my service at the United Nations as an independent expert on the U.S. Human Rights Subcommission. And the first time I was approached by someone in the MEK and asked to sponsor a resolution condemning the regime in Iran. And I have to tell you, when the fellow who came up to me and handed me this packet first approached me, I was a little nervous. What was this MEK, the Mujahideen al-Kek? Who were they? Were these people that I should be dealing with? And certainly the State Department was not anxious for me to deal with them at the time, but I was an independent expert. So I looked at the material. I looked at what they were talking about. I looked at the abuse they were describing in their material, what was going on in Iran at the time. And as an American, it wasn't all that many years after the hostage crisis, and so I had an automatic suspicion. Well, fast forward a number of years to, I think it was 2012, when I was first invited to come to an event in Paris for the NCRI. It was my first opportunity to meet the leader of this movement, Mariam Rajavi. And I have to tell you, my first reaction was how charismatic she was. Here was a woman who had firmly held beliefs, who believed in all of the things that I believe in. A belief that people should be free to choose their own leaders. A belief that religion is important, but every individual has the right to choose to believe how he or she wishes or not to believe if they don't. The freedom to have access to a free press where you can actually find out what's going on in the world. The right to have a free judiciary, an independent judiciary. And all of these things to me made sense. So having watched the NCRI, having watched over the years as this great movement pulls people together both inside and outside Iran, the diaspora, as well as people who are still living in Iran and are fighting the regime from within. It seems to me that Madame Rajavi and the movement she leads offers an alternative I don't see elsewhere. I certainly don't see it in the Shah and the former Shah's family. I don't see it in those who believe that it's possible to compromise with the mullahs, who every time there is an election are somehow looking for this new moderate leader who's going to change everything in Iran, and then the only thing that changed is how many people are hung from the cranes in Tehran. I don't see it in those who criticize the NCRI and its movement. I see it from the people who want to see regime change. We've seen now since last fall this uprising of the people. They're rising up not just because they can't afford bread, because they can't get jobs, because they don't have the kind of life that they want to lead. They are rising up because they realize that they will never have those things as long as the mullahs rule in Iran. So that's the leadership that I'm looking forward to. That's the leadership that I think the people of Iran want. And the proof is going to be, as the English say, in the pudding. It's going to be when the people of Iran are able to choose their own leaders. It will not come from the outside. It will not come from an agreement with the United States or any group of countries to make bargains with the mullahs. And it is less likely to come if such an agreement ends up in a nuclear-armed Iran. Then it will not just be the people of Iran who will suffer. All of us will be in peril and in imminent danger. So I believe that the NCRI offers the way forward, that Madame Rajavi's 10-point plan is a plan that I believe will be embraced by the people of Iran. And now the question is, how do we give them that opportunity?
Excellent. You know, Linda, you spoke about the 10-point plan by Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, and I think it's important to also recite a latest development. About 3,600 parliamentarian members from around the world have publicly supported the 10-point plan by Mariam Rajavi, which essentially really passes the litmus test of what you were talking about, Senator توریسلی, in terms of being able to forge that international coalition based on the same democratic principles that we all believe in and we all have experienced in our respective countries. So, and I love your reference about the Iranian regime change. That is absolutely the message that's coming from the streets of Iran. So, Tony, I want to turn to you. I think a few months ago, you wrote an article in the National Post, where in that article, you talked about the role of the MEK, which is the primary organization to the broader coalition of the Iranian freedom movement, the National Council of Resistance of Iran. And you talked about their path forward for a free Iran, a non-nuclear secular republic Iran. Tell us how you arrived at that conclusion that, yes, NCRI is indeed the alternative.
تونی کلمنت، وزیر خزانه‌داری کانادا 2015، وزیر صنایع 2011. بسیج دروغ پراکنی رژیم نشان دهنده اهمیت این جنبش است. اگر آنها آنقدر اهمیت برای شورای ملی مقاومت و سازمان مجاهدین قائل نبودند، این حجم از تلاش برای پراکندن اطلاعات نادرست را به عمل نمی آوردند.
Well, thank you. I do want to say at the outset, just the pace of change that affects Iran has only accelerated in the last few months by not only factors within Iran, but also certain geopolitical factors outside the country. And of course, what's happened since the last gathering here is the uprising in Iran itself, a huge event which illustrates by the reaction of the regime how important regime change is, that people are standing up for their rights, standing up to the mullahs, standing up to the internal terrorism. They are deliberately killing and arresting people who just want their freedoms. So when I wrote that article, that was all before this, but of course, I think the desire for change has increased. And of course, the topic for our conversation is, what is the alternative? Because the Iranian regime, as we heard from the first session today, would like others to believe that there really is no alternative, that the alternative is bad, that the alternative is in some way defective. But of course, that's not the case. And when I got to meet with Madame Rajavi in just this past January, it was clear to me how sincere she is. And we have this plan, and it has already been discussed here already, this 10-point plan that is coming before various legislatures and parliaments around the world. The fact of the matter is, this is gaining credence around the world, that people are realizing that there is a bona fide alternative that is walking the walk. And you mentioned it, Madame, that this is a democratic, pluralistic alternative. They do not want a theocratic state. They do not want a nuclear state. They want a separation of faith from the state, and they want pluralistic democratic values. And what more can you ask from an opposition than that? I ask you. Madame Rajavi is sincere about this. Of course, we cannot predict the future, but that's not a bad place to start in terms of an organized opposition. To have those goals in place, to have the infrastructure in place, and to have this plan. So I feel that that augurs well. I feel that the disinformation campaign is illustrative of how important this movement is. If they didn't care so much about the NCRI MEK, they wouldn't be going through all the effort of this disinformation campaign. So I think look, I'm a Canadian. I can send you my best wishes, but it really is up to the people on the street, in all of the cities and towns in Iran, and then all of the people in the diaspora to be unified and to be focused. And that will bring change. I have every confidence that that will bring change.
That's great.
Thank you.
That's right.